Thank you for joining me today as we continue studying with the wonderful things that God revealed to the Apostle Paul. And in Romans book 8, chapter 8, and the struggle of redemption. And actually, it's not just struggle, it's actually suffering that we're talking about. Now, struggle and suffering, I just as soon talk about the victories of the Christian life, the joy of the Christian life, the abundant Christian life. But this is important that we struggle, we talk about the struggles of the Christian life because it's universal. This is something every believer goes through. And Peter, in 1 Peter, chapter 4, verse 12, he writes, "Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you." So the believers who received this letter from Peter, they were going through terrible persecution. And there's a lot of different types of suffering, as we're going to see in Romans 8 today. But that's what they were suffering. And he says, "Don't be surprised, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you." And the point is that as believers, this happens to all of us. Various types of struggles and suffering. And Peter says, don't be surprised. This is not something strange. This is normal in the Christian life. And so I think it's important for us to study this, because when we're going through difficult things, and sometimes you think, what's wrong with me? And has God left me? Or we begin to doubt his promises. We begin to doubt his faithfulness. We begin to doubt ourselves that we're truly perhaps children of God. I mean, you can get so discouraged. And as we're going to see as we study further in this. So it's important to understand that this is you're not abnormal if you're experiencing struggles and suffering. Actually, you're normal. And so let's get into this. Let's look into what Paul writes and tells us what God has shown him. First of all, why do we suffer? Well, verse 16, we're going to be studying from, this is our third lesson on Romans 8. It's got so much great stuff in this book, in this chapter. It's just wonderful. So this is the third part, and it's going to be from verse 16 to verse 27. And then the last part is on the victory of redemption. So we're not going to leave it just at suffering. But this is the reason that we suffer. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. So when we receive Jesus, wrote John 1:12, it tells us that we became his children. We literally become grafted or adopted into God's family. Wow, what an incredible privilege. And so that causes us to rejoice. And it's a wonderful truth. And the Spirit bears witness to this fact. And our spirit bears witness to this. And for that reason, we rejoice. But it also is the reason that we suffer. Because, well, let's read on. So more good stuff first. If children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ. And so we are not only part of God's family, we're not like second-class citizens, or we're not like, well, these are the real children, but we're kind of off in the not real children category. And I have 5 adopted children, and they're my real children. And that's how I look at it. That's how God looks at it. If children, heirs also. And so as children of God, we are heirs of God and fellow heirs with Jesus himself. We are literally become the inheritance that God has for Jesus and so on is our inheritance. And God has this incredible inheritance for us. But then this is the verse that's hard to understand. If indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. Well, what does that mean? That is a bit hard to understand. Well, it certainly doesn't mean suffer with him on the cross. That was suffering that only Jesus could accomplish as the Son of God, the perfect Son of God. And his last words on the cross were, "It is finished." It was completely done. There's nothing we can take away from it or add to it. It's something that was completely done. Our redemption, our forgiveness was completely done. But it still has to be worked out. And our redemption isn't yet totally complete. Well, as we're going to see, studying with Paul, when is it complete? When Jesus returns. When our bodies are redeemed. When we go to be with Jesus in heaven. So, but in the meantime, there's a war going on. Now, Jesus won the victory on the cross 2,000 years ago. But right now, you and I live in the middle of this war. War between good and evil, between God and Satan, between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. That's going on right now. And Jesus is suffering in this war right now. Now, this isn't the suffering on the cross that's extended on. That was once and finished. But this is in a sense, the suffering of I think, the concern of a parent for lost children. And in fact, Peter, I think, writes that Paul writes that God is not, Peter wrote that God is not delaying his coming through some sort of mistake, but he's actually patiently waiting for more people to receive the gift of salvation. Jesus died for the whole world, but so few people have received it. And so Jesus keeps waiting as an anguished parent, waiting for his other children to join. And his goal in our life is that we have part in that. And his goal in our life is that we become like him. And so he changes us, and some of the suffering we go through makes us like him. And so this refining that goes on, this is all part of, in a sense, completing our redemption. And so we're children of God. That's established. We're part of God's family. But now there's all this refining. And, Jesus is suffering in this process, in this war, suffering and seeing all the evil in this world and everything else. Then certainly, since we're part of the family, when one member of the family suffers, they all suffer. And so if our Heavenly Father suffers, if the Spirit, as we're going to see, groans over our suffering, if Jesus groans and suffers with the concern for those who are lost in this world, and the terrible things that he has to witness, certainly then you and I, being part of that family, as long as we're part of that family and don't give up and leave the family, we're going to be suffering with the rest of the family. We're going to be suffering with Jesus, and because this is a war and it's not yet finished. So that's the fundamental reason. And now, what are the different causes of suffering, types of suffering that we run into that Paul talks about? And there are many besides just that which Paul talks about. Well, in Romans 7, we ran into the very first one, and Paul writes about this in verse 21. If I find that the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. Well, Paul is talking about the battle between the two natures that we have. When we believed in Jesus, we were born again. The Holy Spirit came and lived in our hearts when our sins were forgiven and began to write God's will and God's laws within our heart. We became children of God at that point. So that is our new nature. And from the heart, we love God and we want to do what's right and we want to please him. But we also have this old nature, this evil that is present within us, this sin nature that wants to rebel against God. And as Paul talks about in Romans 7, the whole last part of it, is that there's a battle within us. And, that's a terrible struggle. In fact, it's so bad that Paul writes, wretched man that I am. He was so frustrated with this battle, and perhaps you're frustrated too. We all are frustrated. Every Christian goes through this, different degrees, but we all go through this struggle between our old sinful nature, which trips us up and keeps us from doing the good that we want to do. Really frustrating. So that's one thing that we suffer, and that is suffering, as Paul expresses here. And then if we look in another place that Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 3:3, he writes to the church in Corinth. And this was a very spiritual church. They had all the gifts of the Spirit were present there. Paul writes very highly about them, but there were also problems. For since there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not fleshly? And are you not walking like mere men? There was dissension, strife, arguing, even factions in the church in Corinth. Now, is this right? Paul writes, are you not fleshly? That is, walking in the flesh, not walking in the Spirit. Listening to your old nature, letting it control your old sinful nature and not walking in the new nature. Are you not walking like mere men? That is, like humans who've not yet received Jesus and haven't been born again? Well, that's exactly what they were doing. Now, was it just the church in Corinth? I can tell you, it's every church. Every church goes through times like this. And in fact, it's not just in church, it's in families. It's it's with our Christian friends, with our oftentimes with other Christians who we should get along with, just great. But sometimes we it's the sinful nature in others. We have a sinful nature. I'm as a husband have a sinful nature. My wife has a sinful nature. Sometimes those two sinful natures clash. Same thing in a church. Sometimes the sinful nature of those of us who are part of a local church clash with one another. And so does that cause joy and happiness in our lives? Even when we win maybe an argument? No, it doesn't. It always ends up in unhappiness and disillusionment and things like that. But it's also normal. It also happens among every Christian, every church. We all go through things like this, suffering because of conflicts with others, because either we or them or both of us are really walking in the flesh and not in the spirit, obeying our sinful natures. So that's another source of suffering. And then we get into Matthew 24. Jesus talks about the period of time we live in right now, which began when Jesus rose from the dead. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. Jesus won the victory on the cross. He rose from the dead. He triumphed over Satan and the devil, over sin and evil and death. But the war goes on. The war goes on until he returns. And so during that time, what happens? Well, sin is still in the human race. And the majority of people have not received Jesus. And so that sin that's in the entire human race results in wars and various other atrocities happening. And kingdom will rise against kingdom. And so just simply sin that's in the entire human race that causes constant crime and wars and cruelties, that's going to get worse and worse as we get closer to Jesus' return. And so that's the struggle of, in a sense, completing redemption. And so Jesus is part of that struggle. Are we part of it? We definitely are, because we're his children. And in various places, there will be famines and earthquakes. And well, you could add to that plagues, COVID-19. You could add to that fires. That's what I have in my area in California, Northern California, and also earthquakes. Nature is corrupted by sin. Sin not only affected the human race, it affected all of nature too. And natural disasters, that's going to get worse and worse till Jesus returns. And so that's part of the suffering. It's just part of the suffering that is part and parcel of this age because we're in the middle of a war. And then Jesus writes in verse 8 of chapter 24 of Matthew, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Oh boy. This is just what we're experiencing right now. What they experienced back then are just the beginning. Things are going to get a lot worse in this war. And then Jesus says, then they will deliver you to tribulation, and they will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Persecution. And when Jesus came from heaven and was born as a Son of Man, from the Virgin Mary, came into this world. It took 33 years before the rulers of this world to rise up and kill him. And so persecution, that's what they did to Jesus. Jesus said, that's what they'll do to you too. They hate Jesus, and because we're his children, they're going to hate us. Now, is that easy at all? Of course, that's never easy. And just the idea of people hating you without cause, that's immensely painful. But not only that, it gets worse. And at that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Fall away, that means leave Jesus. And I think this is probably the worst thing of all. People who fellow believers, perhaps in our own family, in our own church, who love the Lord will fall away from him. And not only that, they will persecute us. Well, that's awful. Persecution is awful, but it's even more awful, I think, the pain that we feel, the pain that God feels when someone walks away from this gift of eternal life. The pain that we feel in the loss of a dear brother or sister. And I don't know about you, but I can think of names that come to faces that just appear in my mind right now of people I grieve over because they've fallen away. They've left Jesus. They've gotten discouraged. They've gotten deceived by the lies of Satan. And so they've just walked away. And so that is painful. Then Jesus writes, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. And so this is the point, that in this war, in this battle, as we experience it from all these different sources of things that try us, that tempt us, that cause us to doubt God's love for us, doubt his promises, doubt the things that he's done in our lives, all these temptations that come upon us and battles that happen because of this, it's so easy to get discouraged and either give up and walk away. And so Jesus' word is simply hang in there because his victory is completely guaranteed. And as we stick with Jesus, hang on to him, in a sense, we're going to be carried into that victory. But that's the key thing, is perseverance, to endure, to stand firm. Now, the battle is going to be won by Jesus, not by us. But as we stand firm in our faith in him, he carries us through to that victory. So, and then finally, in verse 14 of Matthew, Jesus gives us the reason for all this. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So, as we said before, Jesus died on the cross for everyone, the whole world. And he's waning and waning for the gospel to be preached to every last person, man, woman, and child on this planet. And then he's going to return. And who has that job? You and I as believers. And so that's the end of the war. That's when things finally come to an end, is when, in a sense, the full number of Gentiles and Jews have all received Jesus and come into the kingdom. Then finally the end will come. So, and then of course, things will become glorious when Jesus returns. And Paul talks about that in verse 18 of Romans 8. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time, from his time to ours, are not worthy to compare with the glory that is to be revealed to us. When Jesus returns, what an incredible glory there will be. The glory that we experience in suddenly being, if we're still alive, caught up into the air and our bodies being instantly transformed. And if we've already gone to be with the Lord, our bodies being resurrected and our spirits being reunited with our bodies. And suddenly we're all up in heaven together with Jesus, and we have our new bodies, and they don't get sick and they don't die anymore. And best of all, we don't have that sin nature that we constantly fight with. And we only have our new born again nature, and we're totally in harmony, harmony with one another and with the Lord. I mean, that's glorious. And we're going to see Jesus face to face in his full glory. We see him as in a mirror. We see dimly, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. But then we're going to see him face to face. And so at that time, all that we've gone through, all that we've had to endure, it's just going to fade from memory. And so the next point is that we do not suffer alone. And I think this is so often when I'm going through something, I think it's just me. It's something wrong with me. And I don't tell anybody. I'm kind of quiet and I'm kind of suffering in silence. And that's exactly the opposite of what God wants us to do. We don't suffer alone. Every Christian goes through these things. But not only that, creation is in a sense suffering with us. And this is kind of an incredible statement here in Romans 8, verse 19. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. Anxious longing of creation. Everything God's created, in a sense, is waiting eagerly for us to be revealed. Well, when are we revealed? When we go to be with the Lord, when we're perfected, when we're in heaven and we no longer have any sin or anything else in our new resurrected bodies, we will be glorious. And something incredible will happen when that occurs. That's the revealing of the sons of God. Right now, I'm two people, my old nature and my new nature, but the only nature that's going to endure and be part of that is my new nature. You and I are going to be incredible because of what Jesus has done for us and in us. Not because of anything in ourselves, but we're going to be glorious and incredible. And creation is anxiously waiting for the day that our redemption is complete totally. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, because of him who subjected it. So when Adam and Eve sinned, it spread to the whole human race. But not only that, the effects of sin corrupted all of creation. That's incredible. But just as sin corrupted all of creation, when we as human beings, our redemption is totally complete and we go to be with the Lord, creation itself will be set free. That was by God's will. And so he writes about that in the rest of verse 21, that the creation itself will be set free from its slavery to corruption. So that the creation itself is almost like its creation has a sin nature. I mean, plagues and earthquakes and death itself, all these things, were they part of the Garden of Eden? No, none of that was part of the Garden of Eden. They didn't have floods, they didn't have fires, they didn't have anything like that. Nature gone crazy is a result of sin. It's a result of the corruption of sin, its effect on all of creation. And so Paul writes, creation itself is waiting to get set free from this futility, from this corruption. And it's going to be set free by what? By our redemption. Creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Who's the children of God? Me and you. Whose glory? It doesn't even say God's glory. It says our glory. But that comes from God. And if we have any glory, and we will have glory, it's strictly because of Jesus. And so what awaits for us in the future is so incredible. And God has ordained it. That when we're set free totally from sin and all its effects, and we're totally with the Lord in heaven forever and ever, all of creation is set free also. And Jesus, as Jesus says, he will create a new heavens and a new earth without sin or sickness or death or anything. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the chains of childbirth together until now. The pains of child's birth. Whose birth? Well, that's going to be our birth, in a sense, when we're born into this, our new perfected selves. And so the whole creation groans. That is, it's waiting for this. It suffers, groans and suffers, waiting for that to happen. Because creation itself wants to see that happen, that it would be set free. So what a glorious thought. And so this is something interesting to think about, that the whole creation groans along with us, seeing our suffering, in a sense, waiting for our redemption to be complete, and concerned about us, and concerned that every single person receive this free gift of forgiveness and become children of God. Creation groans with us. We don't groan alone. Not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves. And so indeed we groan. And as we talked about with Paul with Romans 7, we've received the first fruits of the Spirit. The Spirit comes into our heart and replaces hatred with love and impatience with patience, and produces faithfulness and all these wonderful qualities within us. And so that's happened. That's started already in our lives. That's the first fruits of the Spirit. And are we satisfied with what's happened so far? We're glad about it, but do we want more? We're never satisfied until we're with the Lord, perfected in heaven. And so we groan. And again, this is the battle between the new nature, the old, our old sin nature, and our new nature that loves God. So we groan within ourselves. And reading further on, we waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. And so, in a sense, we are already children of God, and we're already adopted sons and daughters of the Lord. But when the resurrection occurs, that's when everything is completely a done deal, finished, complete. And so we wait for that day to come. For in hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope. So we received Jesus when we we learned of our sinfulness, and then we learned of what Jesus accomplished on the cross, and that he died for us, he took our sin and our punishment, and our relationship with God can be restored, we can be forgiven We become children of God. We're given eternal life. All these wonderful promises. But has all of this happened yet? Well, we've been born again. We know the Spirit of God. We understand His word. Do we still struggle with that old sinful nature? We do, but that will be no longer. Once we either go to be with the Lord, or once we're caught up in heaven to be with Him when He returns, if we're still alive. So the resurrection, in a sense, is tied right into this sudden end of this conflict that we have within ourselves, and it causes conflicts between us. That this sudden freedom from this old sin nature, it's tied right into the resurrection of our bodies. And so our bodies haven't been transformed. They haven't been resurrected yet. But we're waiting for that, and we're looking forward to that. And that's our hope. That this is hope in the sense of faith. We were promised that, we believe that, we hope, and we know that that's what's going to happen. But we haven't yet seen it. For who hopes for what he already sees? So we haven't yet seen that happen, but we still believe. And if we hope for what we do not see with perseverance, we wait eagerly for it. And so this is talking about faith. It's believing God to do the impossible, to do things that we can't imagine, and this transformation into our heavenly eternal selves. Wow, that's going to be so exciting. And now with perseverance, we go through all these difficulties waiting for that. But not only that, it's not only we who suffer and groan, and creation that suffers and groans, and other believers who suffer and groan. In the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness. And this is tough. God sees our weakness, and He's worried about us, and He's concerned with us. And if we read on in verse 8:26 of Romans, for we do not know how to pray as we should. I mean, sometimes things get so bad in my life that, and sometimes nobody sees this but myself, but I don't even know how to pray. I don't even know what to pray about. Sometimes I'm involved in church conflicts, and I have no idea what to do, especially since I'm a pastor of a Cambodian church and I'm an American. Our backgrounds are so different. I don't know how to solve problems. We do not know how to pray as we should. But look at the rest of this verse. But the Spirit Himself intercedes for us. God's Spirit prays for us, prays for these struggles we're going through. And with groanings too deep for words. Sometimes we wonder, does God really care about my suffering, or does He just kind of, as a really strict coach or trainer, He just kind of watches while I do the 150 push-ups or something, and is not too, doesn't feel the pain and isn't too worried about it, just, has me go through it. It tells us that the Spirit groans with concern for us, prays with groaning, like a mother or a father praying for their children who are fallen into sin or some problem. They pray with groaning. They're deeply concerned. And so I see this word groaning, and I think that's what the Spirit is doing. The Spirit is interceding. When you and I are weak, God is deeply concerned. The Lord is concerned. The Spirit intercedes, prays to the Father, prays to the Son, prays, and the prayer is amazing. The Spirit groans for us. And He who searches the hearts, that is the Spirit, knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because He intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And so the Father knows the mind of the Spirit. Jesus knows the mind of the Spirit. The Spirit knows our hearts, searches our hearts, knows exactly what we need, and prays for us those exact needs according to the will of God. Well, the promise of Jesus was that if you ask anything in my name and according to the will of the Father, it'll be granted to you. And so who knows the will of the Father better than the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the Father, the Spirit of the Son, perfectly prays for us, intercedes for us, exactly according to our needs and exactly according to the will of God. Are those intercessions, are those prayers going to be answered? Guaranteed, absolutely guaranteed. And so this encourages us, but it now brings us, in verse 8:27, we transition. We transition from the suffering of simply being part of the battle, the war that's going on in redemption of the human race and redemption of our own, of us, and until we become perfect children of God in heaven. So we now transition into the absolute, total victory that's in Jesus. And then when we receive Jesus, it's part of our inheritance. That begins in verse 28. It begins in verse 27. When your Spirit's praying for you, you can't lose. But in verse 28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. You and I are called according to God's purpose. You and I love God because he first loved us and sent his Son to redeem us. And so God causes all things to work together for good. Good things, bad things, evil things the devil does, evil things even that we do, our own mistakes. God causes all things to work together for good for you and I. That is next week's topic. So this week we talked about the suffering of redemption, which is our experience now. But the victory of redemption is also our experience now and will be the final and total and finishing experience we have for all eternity. So that's the rest of Romans chapter 8. And so please come back next week and we'll study Paul's words, what God has shown him. And I think you'll find that it's quite amazing. And in the time being, I would just encourage you to be encouraged. Remind yourself you're not alone. Things you're suffering, other believers throughout all of history and in every place are going through the same things. Others are suffering with you and for you. Not only all of creation, but even the Lord himself. And so we're not alone. Be encouraged. Encourage one another. I think this is so important. I think discouragement is one of the biggest things that in a sense can cause us to fall away from the faith or cause us to stumble in our Christian faith. We need one another. It was never God's will that we should be Christians by ourselves. And we need to be encouraged. We need the encouragement of each other. And that's why, we're not under the law where we have to observe days and so on. But you know what? Paul says in Hebrews, don't neglect the gathering together of the brethren. We need one another. I need your encouragement. You need my encouragement. And I hope these messages encourage you, but I definitely need yours. We need to encourage one another. And that's God's will. That's how we receive encouragement from the Lord. That's how I receive it in my life. It's most often God uses other believers to encourage me. And so thank you for all the good comments some of you give on the messages. If you're encouraged, it so encourages me. And persevere. It can get really difficult, and I know that. And it makes you wonder sometimes, is this worth it? The resounding answer is that it is definitely worth it. And once Jesus returns and we're with him and we've been resurrected and everything's done, new heavens and the new earth, the new Garden of Eden, we'll forget the sufferings of this life. I don't think we'll remember them at all because of what's going to come is so glorious. So may the Lord bless you and encourage you. And please read Romans 8 several times between now and next week, and we'll get into it. There was a period in my life when the Lord directed me to read Romans chapters 1 through 12 every single day for a whole year. And that really set me free from a lot of bondages and a lot of depression and other things that came from really the lies of Satan. And so reading the Bible, boy, one thing I hope that these teachings, these studies in Romans will encourage you to read Romans for yourself. May the Lord bless you. Thanks for joining me.